Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll make a start, seeing as it's just ticked over from 1 o'clock. So you're through and into the workshop, the Parish Digital Communication Revolution. The subtitle of this one is for social media, virtual events, websites, accessibility, and a communication strategy. My name is Mark Tomkins. I'm the creative director and founder at Aubergine, and I'm a parish councillor in Bedfordshire in my private life. And riding shotgun with me is Daniel from Breakthrough. We're going to be going through a whole swathe of elements relating to digital communications, how you can factor that in terms of a strategy and getting the most out of it whilst really staying both compliant and operate with some best practice processes. So I think we're going to get stuck straight in. I'm going to share my screen right now, which is that button there. And away we go. So, as I said, Parish Digital Communication Revolution, that's the theme of this afternoon's workshop. And there's me, and there's Dan, and we're both counsellors in our private life. What we're going to cover today, I think we're going to cover the really creating a meaningful communication of strategies, how to incorporate the mix of traditional and digital aspects to really make it work for your council, both in terms of the services and the priorities. We're going to tackle the bit of where is your council. We're going to look at where you might be when it comes to creating and implementing communication strategy and making use of your channels, such as your website and your social media, to real effective ways to have a two-way communication. We're going to focus on exploring what digital channels and tools are available to you as a council, which to use, perhaps which to use first. We are going to cover a couple of case studies. Both Dan and I have got some real world case studies to bring to you today on effective digital communication methods. All of this is going to be through the filter of trying to maintain both compliance in respect to accessibility laws, transparency code, across the different platforms there, and then really start by directing you in the way to set your council up for success. But I think before we go too far, Dan, would you like to just give yourself a bit of an introduction there?
Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you. I hope you're having a good conference. My name is Dan Purchase. I'm co-director at Breakthrough Communications. We're based down in Brighton in East Sussex, but work with NALC. We're NALC's partners on communications advice and support, as well as data protection and FOI advice and support for councils. But we also work with many county associations across the country and directly with councils to help them communicate more effectively and more compliantly with the councils. And as Mark said, like Mark, I'm also a councillor in my spare time.
Spare time. Yes, indeed.
Okay, so,
just to provide a little bit of background to me, I'm a councillor. I run Aubergine. We're a web development agency in Bedfordshire. Our area of expertise really revolves around accessibility and making websites and digital platforms suitable for those with all forms of disability. As you all know, it's an element of compliance that's come in the last couple of years. It's a technical challenge, it's a technical hurdle, but hopefully throughout today we're going to be helping you better understand it and move forward. I'm also the author of NALC's website accessibility and publishing guidelines that came out just a month ago. So I think let's get stuck in, if I may. Dan, are you happy for us to kick off? Let's go. So the backdrop, why good communication should matter to local councils of all sizes, actually. Parish and town councils look increasingly seen as the go-to council in their area. Communications underpinned by meaningful strategy. You can support the delivery of your council's aims and objectives, as well as its key priorities. Good communication is also vital to ensure that everyone has access to the information. Local services and everything have their voice heard. Fundamentally, everybody has a right to access all information that a council produces. But obviously, if it's stuck in a format or a particular method, it makes it difficult. There are barriers for people to get at it. Another aspect, another part of the council's overall communication mix, digital communications it's never been so important than now, but it does need to run alongside traditional forms of communication as well. I think the last 20 months has shown us that using websites, social media, virtual events, digital surveys, other forms of digital communication have really been the only way to present the information, the council to present the information to its audience and to have that two-way conversation. We've not been able to meet, councils now, we're all starting to go back to those in-person meetings, some trying the hybrid route, some let's hope, who knows about the hybrid going forward, but I certainly think it's an effective way. So look, digital communications has what's made that happen. So there's the backdrop of today, really. But before we get stuck in with some detail, I just want to look back. The last 2 years have seen more digital communications than in any time in history. And it's not just local authority. It's across all forms of organization, business, private life, everything. Digital communications. There was a very good infographic sent around to technical people who saw the level of data transfer between internet service providers over the last 20 months. And it was more than quadruple that of the previous 12 months, just in a really short window. I think incredible. But councils are making a tactical use of the range of digital tools available. But because the level of technical knowledge and experience it differs from one council to the next, it would be really best if it were part of a wider communication and engagement strategy. Some councils are doing this, some aren't, and so on. So a more measured and effective planned approach to digital communications is what's needed. The key takeaway, certainly from Dan and myself of the last couple of years, really, digital communications has seen a huge increase in community engagement between councils and the harder to reach groups, communities. We've seen personal Zoom accounts and creaking IT being used by councils. So hopefully what's come out of that is a recognition that in the precepts that we're all diving into right now, that a good amount of money is being planned in the budget to make sure that digital and IT infrastructure is planned for the future. Big and small decisions being made without being in the room. Well, large corporates have been doing it for years. So why councils can't formally? There we are. But a greater reliance and appreciation of digital communications. It is the future. It is now, but it is very much the future. And we can really leverage all of the benefit points from this to engage with our communities and really have a good two-way conversation. And one of the other, obviously, the lovely takeaways of the last couple of years has been the legend that is Jackie shining a light on council standards, but generally actually just councils. And very often, historically, parish councils have been buried in nowhere. They think that we're just these small little groups of people that sit in village halls that talk about litter picking, I think, and dog bins. But thankfully, okay, it was a bit of a sad reason why, but thankfully, Jackie has shone a light on the amazing work that parish and town councils do. So there's our backdrop. And all of that really needs to be strategized. It's a big word, but Dan, a communication strategy is the way forward, right?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. So as with anything, communication, whether it's digital or non-digital, only works really effectively if there is an effective, resource-appropriate strategy that sits behind it. One of the things that we notice when we go out to work with councils directly is that sometimes council communication output, the things we're doing, whether it's content on our websites, posts on social media, content in our newsletters or e-newsletters, it's sometimes a bit tactical rather than strategic, by which I mean it's all very good. There's good content, there's good messages going out, but it doesn't necessarily tie into a wider strategy around what are we actually trying to achieve and why. And I would suggest, and actually we've just written a blog post for NALC about this, about how a challenge for councils, for parish and town councils in 2022, is to make communications full stop a strategic function rather than something that's tactical. And this is something that parish and towns of all sizes can do. Whether you're a large town council with multi-officer resource, or whether you're a small rural parish with a part-time clerk, actually there are things we can all do to make communication more strategic, because if we get this right, it can help us think about what are we actually trying to communicate? How often? When do we communicate it? What are our communications objectives? And actually, how do we know if we're doing well? What does success look like for us in our council? It can also, though, have a really big impact, positive impact, on how we are seen, heard, and perceived in the community. How we can, it can actually help us to communicate and engage even more effectively with residents, with local organisations, with businesses, with other stakeholders within the community. And as you'll see as a theme running right the way through this, we need to make sure that our digital communications, which is what we're focusing on this afternoon, are accessible and inclusive. Accessibility, as Mark will talk about in a little while, in terms of websites is crucial, but it doesn't stop there. It should run through everything that we do, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. So very briefly, I want us to talk through, excuse me, how can we make our communications more strategic? How can we create a communication strategy in our council? And what are the tools and platforms available to us? So next slide, please, Mark. Thank you. So this is actually an entire training session in and of itself, and something that is very difficult to cover in a very, very brief session such as this. But I do just want to offer the way that we at Breakthrough Communications, the sort of route we take when councils say, can you help us build and implement a communications strategy? And I just want to sort of summarize some of the key points for you, because you can do this yourself. And if you've already got a communications and engagement strategy in place, these tools will help you to review it and ensure that it's as effective and appropriate as it can be. First of all, what is the why? Why are we doing this? Why are we creating this strategy? What are we trying to achieve? And what is the approach that we will take? How will we involve both members and officers working together? That's something I'm very passionate about as a councillor myself. Developing a good communication strategy is a great way to bring officers and members together and get buy-in. That's really, really important. We then need to think about, okay, what's gone on before and how do we do things now? How do we currently communicate as a council? What are the different channels that we use, both traditionally and digitally? What do our councillors and officers think about those? And here's a top tip for you. One of the things that we always do with councils when we go into councils is we carry out an anonymous, must be anonymous, survey, very brief survey of officers and members, asking them just a few questions about what they think about the council's existing approach to public-facing communications and engagement, because that gives officers and councillors a safe space to offer constructive, honest views on what we're doing well and what we could improve. We then need to think about, well, what are the priorities of our council? What services do we have? What facilities are we keen to promote? Are we going through, I don't know, a neighbourhood planning process at the moment, for example? What are the things that matter to us? What are our aims and objectives? And then we take all of those and try and distill down a series of communications objectives, so that communications doesn't become just this thing that sits over here that's nebulous. Actually, it helps us deliver and support the delivery of our key priorities and the things that matter to us as a council. Having created communications objectives, we then need to think about, well, who are the different audiences that we are seeking to communicate with? At a very simplistic level, you could say, well, it's local residents. And yeah, that's part of the people that we're trying to communicate with. But actually, we could break down residents into all sorts of subcategories, couldn't we? Because there will be times when a council, for good reason, will want to communicate with distinct audiences. It may be, for example, a council looking to review a particular service aimed at young people and would want input and views from younger demographics. It may be geography. If you've got, as we often hear now, lots of, let's say, new housing estates and areas in your parish or town that don't historically engage with the council, you might want to put extra effort into communicating with them. And for each of these audiences, what are the messages? What are the communications messages that we're seeking to get across? And here's a great question as a sort of starter for 10 for you. In your council, have the following conversation. If we were to go and knock on 50 doors in your town, in your village, or in your communities and say, what do you know about the parish or town council? What would residents say? What would we want them to know about our council? That's a great question to start as to get a conversation going. We then, and only at this point, need to think about, well, the how, which communications channels should we use? And this afternoon, we're going to talk through very briefly a number of digital channels that many of you, in fact, I know looking at the screen as to who's here, many of you are using, but others that you could consider starting to. Having done all of that, we then need to put together a resource appropriate plan that sets out how we're going to communicate and how often, and what are the responsibilities, who's going to actually make it work? Is it something that's entirely officer-led, which would usually be the case in larger parish or town councils? In smaller parish or towns, there are often, for example, communications working groups where councillors support the clerk and any other officers in delivery of such communications. And very lastly on this point, the worst kind of strategy, no matter what we're talking about, is one that sits either in somebody's mind or in somebody's drawer. This has got to be a living, breathing document that evolves over time, so that as things change, as external factors impact on how we communicate, we can evolve and adapt, which is something I think this sector is really good at doing. Over to Mark to talk. I'm sorry, before we get to websites, just a couple of sort of case studies really. I just want to highlight. We've done this for actually several dozen councils across the country of all sizes, but we did, over the last year, we've created two in particular. But I just wanted to highlight very briefly where we've gone in and done the work to create comm strategies for councils. And actually what's been very positive is that councils have, either whether they do it themselves or whether they ask someone like us to go and do it for them, is it actually brings people together and focuses minds on why communications, as Mark was talking about earlier, have never been more important. And we do need to think about how we resource communications within our council from a budget perspective and from a human resource perspective too. And there's a couple of quotes there from both Bletchley and Fenny Stratford Town Council and Ware Town Council about how useful they found it to get a communication strategy in place. But using that sort of 8-step process that I've just walked you through, you can do this yourself too, either to create a strategy from scratch or to review what you already have. And believe me, because we see it all the time, it will give you a step change in when you start to look at your content, your platforms and everything else. A good strategy should sit behind all of what we're doing. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Dan. One of those key channels, as we all know, that every size of council can use, is a website. Now, let's preface that by saying that obviously September 2020 saw the introduction of the accessibility publishing laws, and that every website needed to be or meet the WCAG 2.1 standard. Now, to start with, that created a great deal of concern and confusion because nobody really knew outside of the web development industry what that meant. I think with a reasonable amount of communication, the support from the various bodies in our sector, that's been able to be communicated, and it couldn't actually have come at a better time. The requirement to make sure that a website had information on it that everybody in a community could access the information without barrier, as we headed into a pandemic, was incredibly fortuitous. And for the most part, a huge number of councils got straight onto it. Now, for various other reasons, finance, lack of understanding, technical ability, and so on and so forth, and resource, it wasn't initially taken up by a lot. But the benefits to be had from really focusing on making the council's website an accessible and primary source of digital communication is that 1 in 5 people in every community has a disability of one form or another that prevents them accessing the information on a website without some form of barrier. That's an astounding figure, but it is a genuine figure. So if you think about the size of your own parishes and your own towns, I'm sure you can do some very quick maths to work out what that number is. That number, those numbers of people in your parish and your town will struggle to get the information that they are entitled to. So whether you are offering proper frontline services through your website that relate to benefits, housing, children, or whether you are providing information more of a regulatory transparency code type stuff, 1 in 5 people will struggle unless the website has been made accessible. Now, the notwithstanding the technical hurdles of getting there and getting a website to meet these requirements, accessibility isn't just about those technical aspects. It's also about understanding why the information needs to be in a certain format. To focus on one particular point, let's talk about things like minutes and agendas. Historically, very often, clerks and council administrators have produced minutes and agendas, and they've been produced in Word, and they've been wrapped inside big tables full of lots of cells and columns. And those documents have been posted onto their website. That's great and meets the need for the clerk and the councillors during the meeting, because very often they'll have a printed version. The problem is that tables are a terrible experience for people who have sight loss or sight disabilities, because a table does not have any navigation built into it. So as a person who has sight loss, using or opening up an agenda or some minutes where the content has been put inside a table full of cells and columns, I will have no idea how to navigate through that and in what order. So just a very small thing like that makes an enormous difference. So taking the content out of tables, putting them in accessible Word documents, following good heading structures, so using headings in sequence, and then making a PDF. Microsoft Word, since 2016, has had an inbuilt accessibility checker. I must talk to 6 or 7 clerks every week who are unaware of that function. But it's there, it's under the review tab, and then there's a button, and it even tells you how to fix the accessibility problems, so that you know once you've got there and it says there are no accessibility problems, you can save that safely as a PDF, knowing that it is going to be accessible, and you can upload it to your website, and then anybody with disabilities or uses assistive technology can use it. But it isn't just the technical sides. It's language as well. It's where and how you communicate. Reducing the barriers, not just in terms of the technical ones, file sizes, file formats, and so on, but the language. Opening up the language and making it in a nice, plain English way. Say what you mean, because that's going to better enable a two-way conversation for more people. So one of the takeaway sets of tips is from out of this recent experience is making sure that you have an accessible website. But one thing to remember, please, if your website uses one of those plugins that puts a little circle in the top there with a little picture of a man, and when you press it, it provides some tools, this is not accessible. It is a very quick and dirty way to add a few featured tools, but actually it creates an enormous barrier for people with disabilities. Scope, one of the UK's biggest disability charities, have recently published something that supports this very aspect, and it's something that I've been championing for about the last 2 years. These quick and dirty plugins make more barriers for a disabled person than problems they solve. So if your website has one of those on it, you aren't meeting accessibility. So you should look at revisiting that. Have an accessibility process checking process in place. There are lots of very excellent and free tools out there. If you use the Google Chrome browser, you can download a free tool called Wave by WebAIM, and you can go to any page on your website and run a check, and it will tell you whether it meets accessibility or not, and it will give an explanation what the problems are and how to tackle it. Now, some of them are going to be technical ones that you're going to need your web developer to help. Others are going to be content related, which you can sort out. As I've said before, language and comprehension are of equal importance when it comes to accessibility. It goes back to Dan's point about communication. The language that we use, historically, sometimes the language that councils have used have been quite technical, and it needs to be opened up. You know, we want to encourage the younger kids into being councillors. I mean, I'm 51 and I am the youngest person on our council, but I'd like to see some 30-somethings on our council because the council represents them. The other aspect when it comes to websites is making sure that the transparency code checking is in place. I see a lot of this, and there's a lot of perhaps lack of knowledge when it comes to what exactly needs publishing on a website to meet transparency code. Luckily, the NAUC guide that's recently been published has a very clearly defined bullet-pointed list of all of the things that you need to publish as a council. There are 2 levels, as we know, smaller, larger. So if you are unsure, there's a list. Go and download the free NAUC guide, and there'll be a list in there of things that you need to make sure are published from a regulatory point of view on your website. A definition of the website's purpose according to the communication strategy and plan. That's a really good idea. What do you want the website to do? It doesn't have to do everything. It doesn't have to be all singing, all dancing. As a council, decide what you want that website to deliver. Is it just the regulatory stuff? Fine. If you don't have the resource or the capacity to be able to do anything other than that, great. Do that bit well. There's a clearly defined list of what needs to be done. Or widen that. Widen it. Start to use it as that platform to engage in that two-way conversation with your community. So having that content strategy, not using the website as a dumping ground just to chuck it up there in the hope that you're going to meet compliance. Make sure that you've got your regulatory stuff up there. As a public body, obviously you have to do that. You're going to get picked up on that as part of your audit. Community-oriented messaging and content. What you want to publish, the community support and info, news and events, that's the stuff that you want to start to widen out. Make that part of your strategy. Don't try and boil the ocean. There's lots of people out there doing that, unfortunately, already anyway. But take on what you can. Focus on small areas to add to your website over time. Detailed and content-rich information. So this is really good. And it absolutely follows along the thread of that Dan will support shortly, and that is use social media channels to drive traffic and your members of your community to your website. We very often see it the wrong way round. People say, oh, I want my Facebook or my Twitter feed on my website. No, people are much more likely to hang out in Facebook and on Twitter, than your council's website. So put the shortened versions on the social channel, because that's going to be injected into their life timeline, and give the link back to the council's website so that they get the fuller engagement there. That is the best way to increase awareness of what a council's doing. And ultimately, you can make your council website a resource center, a single point of contact where people can go and get all of the information that they need, and wider than that, the local area, the local services. So I'm just going to give you a few tips before we move on to things like social media. Going back to those plugins, some people call them widgets, some people call them plugins, but if you've got one of those on your website as your means to meet accessibility, you're going to need to revisit that, because they're not compliant. They're called overlays. They create a huge number of problems. Another tip, when you're producing your Word documents, whether it's a meeting agenda, some minutes, whatever it is that you're ultimately going to publish on the website, call the Word document exactly what it is, so that it's going to be easier for you to find on your local computer. But when you then save it as a PDF, the title of that PDF is going to be called exactly what it is. So in my example on the screen here, you will label the file, your parish council minutes, date, so that when it goes onto the website, the link text, as we call it, so when you mouse over on the link to download the document, don't use download, don't use click here, don't use read more. These are really bad for accessibility, because download what? Read more what? Click here what? So your link text should be to where you are going or to what you are opening. So if you called the document, the PDF, exactly what it is, the link text will output exactly what it is. As a blind person, I know my screen reader, my audio announcer, is going to say that there is a link to such and such a parish council minutes, November 2021. And if you want extra brownie points in your link text, say what the file is, it's a PDF, and say how big the file is. This is important, because if you don't say that, and the person might be using it from a restricted internet connection, or they might be using it from their phone, well, you don't want to suddenly cost them 28 megabytes in download if they're on their mobile experience. So be really clear. And again, it's all about transparency. So what is it? Well, it's your parish council minutes. When is it from? November 21. It's a PDF, and it's 672 kilobytes in size. The person is they're now fully equipped to know whether that's what they want to open. So that's a really good thing to do, and it will save you time. Saving files in your own internal documentation labels, such as this example that's on the screen over here on the right hand side, minutes -011121 final _V2. That might be what it's called on your computer, but that means absolutely nothing to the reader if you upload them to the website, but people do. So there's some tips there for you in terms of websites. Now, we had we were lucky enough to be supported in our early development here at Aubergine when we created the accessible web service. Our local town council, Leighton Linslade, fully supported us in being one of the first in the country to have one of our new accessible website services. The case study, really, the starting point, they had a website before 2018, and it was a 5-year-old Drupal-based website. There was no accessibility compliance. It rarely met transparency code, not through any inaction of the council, but just the functionality didn't allow them to upload what they needed to, and it wasn't mobile friendly. So the council knew that the website was a powerful and necessary communication tool. It's got lots of things that it needed to communicate out to its sort of 40,000-ish residents. But unfortunately, the existing website was out of date in terms of capability, and there were some unresolved technical issues. They maintained it as best they could within the restrictions of its capabilities, but it was time consuming. So And here's just a quick screen snap of what it looked like. So investment was what they sought. It was an investment in a communication tool. It's a key part of the overall communication strategy that the town council undertook. And it's a central mechanism to that infrastructure. The key elements being they identified in that brief that we worked with them: better, more editable website admin system. We built it on WordPress, easy to administer. It was accessible out of the box. It was more responsive. We knew, looking at the analytical data, that more than 70% of all council website visitors were looking at it on their phone. So it had to lead with mobile responsiveness. A clear, open design so that it's easy for people to read. What comes into play here are things like people with dyslexia. And dare I say, as we all get a bit older, when you look at the stuff on the web page, you don't want to see loads of it jammed on there. Clear, open space with the text. The other key elements there are making sure that it was hosted in the UK, software was all updated regularly, and that there was a low technical knowledge requirement on the council's communication team. It wasn't going to be a great steep uphill learn for them. And of course, it must have some longevity built into it. So we recorded the process of the ways of working, the communication challenges that they faced, and how they desired what was the outcome? What was the desired outcome? How did they want to communicate? What were the concerns and the visions? And from there, really, we ask the question, fast forward 6 months from now, what do you have? Well, we went through a discovery process. We defined the design and we defined the sitemap, so the list of pages, what and where in relation, and also identified those key messages. Now, obviously, over time, those messages, those signposts, those go here for this, go there for that, they would change according to key changes in messaging. But we identified that and got started straight away. Now, I think it's worth just mentioning right now for a moment that Dan and I are going to make these course notes available. All of this strategy information course notes going to be available to download. I don't know if that's going to be available on a Nauk URL, but what we'll do is we'll pop a link in the chat toward the end for you to download it from one of our URLs. So ultimately, we provide guidance. We've reviewed the Google Analytical data to establish the patterns of the users, and we developed the website for them. We've given them accessibility training so that they, on the day-to-day basis, fully understand what is accessible and what is not. It's about empowering them to be able to go forward with that knowledge. Reviewed by their stakeholders and their test user groups to get approval, and then launch the website with a regular accessibility process checking in place. Every month or so, going to key pages, checking it using the tools. After every change of a page, checking it before making it live. And then just looking at the analytical data to make sure that every 2 or 3 months, the traffic and the user flow through the website is doing what it should be doing. So that's what we delivered. We're very proud to support Leighton Linslade Town Council ongoing with their website. We gave them predefined page templates so that they didn't need to do any coding. And on the whole, moving forward, the communications team there are fully supported by us. But as part of the overall feasibility and digital communication guidance role, this formed a fundamental part of that strategy. And really, it makes a key and fundamental part in that strategy. Out of that, actually, what was a really great thing is they were awarded the Gold Award, local council scheme Gold Award, and which was in part due to the council being able to evidence all of the 52 requirement links on their website. So we'd like to take a small element of that in our part in that. But obviously, look, there's some snaps of it there, but you can head on over to the Leighton Linslade Town Council website yourself. But Dan, I think what then comes from website, the other natural digital communication really are things like newsletters and so on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so we're now going to talk about digital newsletters, and then we're going to talk about the biggie, the one that we get asked about the most, and that's social media. So let's talk very briefly about digital newsletters. Now, in brief summary, these sort of fall into two different categories, and councils, in my experience, are doing two different things. Some councils are taking their existing printed newsletter and turning it into a PDF, and then making it accessible on the website to download, or sometimes they are emailing it out to some degree. And that is in a sense a digital newsletter, but actually there's lots of opportunities that we're missing if that's what we're doing. However, if that's what we are doing, so we're taking our printed newsletter, when printed newsletters, I believe, are a really important part of a council's overall communication mix. I think they're really important. What you do need to do, though, if that's what you're doing, you're giving out your newsletter in sort of PDF format, you've got to make sure it's accessible. And as Mark has already talked about, in Word, for example, there is an inbuilt accessibility checker to save you time and effort. There is a caution to be added if you are using any sort of desktop publishing software, professional software, because by default, they are very unlikely to be as accessible. Some of them have accessibility tools built in, but if, for example, I won't name the council, but I was working with a council yesterday who showed me their brand new newsletter, and it looked very nice, it looked very pretty, and it had been designed by a graphic designer. But the graphic designer may not have been aware of accessibility standards or issues. So if you are giving out a sort of PDF version of a digital newsletter, be mindful of that. But what we would always recommend councils do, and this is something we've seen grow exponentially, partly due to COVID, actually. If we think back to spring, summer 2020, when councils were looking for new ways to communicate more effectively with residents, when a lot of the sort of in-person communications were limited, many more councils than ever are now using what we would call e-newsletter or electronic newsletter services. This is where you are using software designed, e-newsletter software, to actually encourage residents to sign up to hear from you as a parish or town council, and then periodically, whether it's monthly, bi-monthly, weekly in some cases, I know of councils, or just on when urgent news comes in and you want to share it, send out emails. So what you're not doing, because you should not be doing this, by the way, is saving hundreds and hundreds of residents' email addresses all within your Outlook or Gmail email system, because therein lies all sorts of pitfalls around information governance, GDPR, etc. We have to be really careful. You should be using software that is designed for the job. The most common, the biggest software out there by far is one called Mailchimp. Chimp as in monkeys. Mailchimp has been around for 20 years. It's very robust. Out of the box, it is not GDPR compliant, so you have to make it GDPR and PECR compliant. But actually, once you've done that, it is a great tool that you can integrate with your website, with your social media, to make it really easy for residents to sign up to hear from you, and then send them out compliant communications. Next slide, please, Mark. I'm just going to skip ahead slightly because of time. Two examples that came in this week, hot off the press or hot off the pixel. One was a parish council in West Sussex. This is Billingshurst, fabulous parish council in the middle of Sussex, who sent out an e-newsletter all about their Christmas fair. And Queen's Park, London's community council, talking about events in December. They can be very powerful ways of communicating topical and timely pieces of information, but once again, we need to ensure that we're using the software's built-in accessibility tools to ensure that the content we're seeking to distribute is as accessible as possible. Next slide, please, Mark. Thank you. And a very, very brief tip, it's also, of course, you need to be mindful of the being able to provide information in other formats too, because you will get requests for items to be published in a range of different formats. Next slide, please, Mark. Thank you. Let's briefly talk about the challenges and opportunities that social media present. So this is probably the thing we get asked about most at Breakthrough by councils, because some councils are not using it at all. Many more are using it to some degree, but often it's very tactical in nature. And some are very experienced and using it as a fully fledged suite of communications platforms. Fundamentally, social media will help your council to reach parts of the community that might not even be aware of the council or the work of it. As somebody myself who at one point 2 years ago, I was serving as a parish district, sorry, as a town, district and county councillor. This was before I had children. Something I noticed, and this is personal, is that many residents do not distinguish between different tiers of local government. How many parishes get queries every day? Why haven't you fixed potholes in my street? Why haven't you picked up dog poo, etc., etc.? Well, actually, social media is a great way of reaching harder to reach groups. It's a great way of explaining in an inclusive, friendly, accessible, engaging way who we are, what we do, and how we do it. There are tools available to help you save time and effort with social media. And it's a great way, as with most digital platforms actually, to use the power of recorded and live video to humanize the council, break down some of the invisible barriers that can exist between councils and communities. But once again, accessibility matters here too. For example, videos on social media should have captions. That's just one very simple example. Next slide, please, Mark. But social media is a massive thing, and we cannot, in the space of just a few minutes, sort of distill it down as much as I would like. But what I will say is there are questions that we need to ask, because each council here today is we've got councils here of all different shapes and sizes, many of which we work with, actually, I can see. And in fact, Carol, I was just talking to Judy, your clerk, so there we go. She sends her best. But you do need to consider, what platforms do you use? Because there are an ever-evolving range of social media platforms. You know, TikTok, Nextdoor, WhatsApp for Business. What do we do? I mean, there are just new ones all the time coming on stream. At a very simplistic level, my advice would always be, parish and town councils should be doing Facebook very well. If you're not using social media, that's where council should start. But Instagram and Twitter are, generally speaking, probably Instagram over Twitter, actually, in my experience, the two that are then very useful for councils to build up an engagement and following with. But we need to think about, do we allow messages to be sent to the council? How do we manage questions that we receive or comments? How do we deal with negativity when it arises, which it sometimes sadly does? And what do councils like us, similar precept size, similar services, do well? Two things to bear in mind very briefly. One is that social media is very chatty and informal compared to almost any other communications medium. And go off, by the way, on Twitter or somewhere and look at businesses, big businesses. You will often see, whether it's supermarkets, whether it's big brand household names, they often talk on social media in a slightly more softer tone of voice than they might do through any other communications medium. So be mindful of that. But again, we need to have a content strategy where we're thinking about, what kind of things are we posting and why? Yes, there will always be timely and topical pieces of information, but let's think about, what are the things we are seeking to communicate and engage with as a council? Next slide, please, Mark. Thank you. Very briefly, and I won't dwell on this, but one of the things you can access is a social media health check, which is entirely free, where we will actually review your social media for you, tell you what you're doing well and how it compares to councils like you. I'll pop a link in the chat, but I won't dwell on that. Next slide, please, Mark. Thank you. I just want to very briefly, for 2 minutes, talk about surveys and consultations, because these are often the lifeblood of a council to enable you to take the pulse of a community. Yet it's really hard to get response, either from a wide range of audiences, if you're carrying out, say, an annual resident survey, or if you're doing a very sort of specific service-based consultation. You should have, alongside any in-person consultation and paper-based consultation, digital engagement and consultation too. So a digital survey or a digital consultation, as well as a virtual engagement event. There are many tools. The two biggest by far to carry out digital surveys are SurveyMonkey and Typeform are two of the big ones. We as an organisation use Typeform because it's entirely accessible. It conforms to the same accessibility standard that your website should be working to. Next slide, please. Very briefly, this is a town council in Kent, Broadstairs and St Peters, where we worked with them on the neighbourhood plan. Now, as everyone knows, that's a very regulated process, lots of rules and regs around that. But actually what we found was we carried out, yes, a paper-based survey and consultation, but we carried it out digitally too. And we used a number of very powerful tools to try and get as much response as possible. And in Broadstairs' case, we had hundreds of responses to the survey from digital responses rather than paper-based responses. Next slide, please. And actually one thing we've done in a few places is link the two together. So we've just completed in the last week a neighbourhood plan survey for Beaconsfield, where we actually put a QR code, for example, on the printed survey, inviting people to take part in the digital survey, because often people are quite happy to do that. And we've seen a lot of people scan through and do that. But just very briefly as well, Billingshurst, back to Billingshurst again in Sussex, carried out a consultation in October 2020 about a skate park. And we used the power of social media to really hone in on likely service users, so particularly younger demographics, and encourage them to take part in a survey. We did peer-to-peer engagement. We recorded a 48-second video clip with captions, again, to be important, this stuff matters, from a local service user who was a young person. We had over 400 more than responses to a survey all about a skate park from local residents, the majority of whom were service users. So there is lots that can be done. Mark.
I'm just going to finish off on something that sometimes has been perhaps just not considered when it comes to accessibility. Many councils over the last couple of years have invested in a bit more forward-looking technology, and that is apps. Now, apps fall under exactly the same rules and realm as a website, and that is they must meet the accessibility requirements. Unfortunately, the vast majority of them, of which we are aware, do not, because they are very, very difficult to make accessible. And actually, for the most part, the apps really rely on the user's own phone settings to meet those accessibility needs. So if you do have an app, then get it checked in terms of accessibility. They are actually a brilliant tool in terms of community-oriented comms. Your website's going to be doing the heavy lifting, but you can use apps for things like trails and events and news-based content to push out those new pieces of news and engagement directly to the user. The phone accepts push notifications, a website doesn't, nothing else does, and it's only an app that can do that. So it really is a powerful thing to look into, but obviously through the filter of accessibility. So check your app, make sure that it meets compliance and is accessible. Think about some interesting purposes, some interesting uses of an app. But it's don't have one just because you think your council needs to have an app because that's the future. It does need consideration. Decide what it is that you want.
And just very lastly, digital streaming of meetings may have gone by the wayside in some respects, although many councils are still finding ways to do it. Virtual engagement events are here to stay. Very, very quick 20-second case study. This, again, going back to Broadstairs, but I think of plenty of other councils too, where in order to promote the neighbourhood plan and get engagement, we held a series of meetings on Zoom, all of which were live streamed to social media. And it's almost impossible to see on screen, but we did 2 meetings, both of which had almost 1,000 views of the live and the recording of the video thereafter. So virtual engagement, whether it's a councillor surgery, a meet the mayor, meet the chairman type session, or something far more regulated or specific, are important too. Thank you.
All right, so we're just going to finish up now, and really across both areas that Dan and I have covered, our final remarks really, more and more councils are making use of digital communications, but really it needs to be considered in terms of a wider strategy. Consider a mix of digital and non-digital. There is, as we have said all along, there is a really strong demand and a strong need to still have that blended approach. Considering how you use social media and how you talk and what you use it for to make you more effective, that's a really good starting point. As Dan said, Facebook, there's your starting point. From an accessibility perspective, yes, it was a little bit of a lumpy, bumpy start, but on the whole, it's been some real bright sparks and flashes of the future there. There's been brilliant adoption of technology. Around, well, more than 50% of councils have all addressed website accessibility, which is great news. But now's the time to take what we've learned and use all of this as in a formed and strategic approach, regardless of the council's size, so that we can go forward with a really good plan and make some good effective use of it.